People on the move, fleeing advances made by pro-Syrian government forces. They packed whatever they could carry and headed towards towns closer to the center of Eastern Ghouta. Displacement is adding to their suffering. Pro-government forces are advancing inside Eastern Ghouta. Since Friday, they've seized at least 10% of the 110 square kilometer enclave. They are moving in from the eastern side, forcing people to pack whatever they can and move to other areas away from the front lines. People are seeking shelter in towns closer to the center. Displacement is adding to their suffering. The ground offensive began just over a week ago. The territory taken is not heavily populated. It's mainly farmlands, which are hard to defend. Pro-government forces want to control the Douma-Shifonia road, which would cut rebel supply lines, cut off the main town of Douma, and split the opposition-held pocket in half. The assault is not just from the ground. Airstrikes and shelling are targeting towns throughout the besieged rebel stronghold. The bombing may have lessened since the 5-hour daily pause in the fighting ordered by the Russian government came into effect on Tuesday, but civilians continue to be killed. It's one of the deadliest offensives in the almost 8-year conflict. The death toll is now more than 650. Rebels have been retaliating by firing mortars into the Syrian capital, killing almost 30 people in the past 2 weeks. The ability of the opposition to threaten Damascus is one of the reasons why the pro-government alliance wants to recapture Eastern Ghouta. It is the last major opposition-controlled area close to the government's seat of power. If pro-government forces take it, then there will be only one small pocket of territory south of the capital out of the government's control. And the pro-government alliance is making it clear, not only in its words, but in its actions, that it is not ready to compromise and it is pushing for a military victory. Despite pleas from humanitarian organizations, aid hasn't reached the almost 400,000 people believed to be in Eastern Ghouta. The United Nations was hoping to deliver food and medical supplies on Sunday. Now it says that won't happen. This isn't the first time restricting humanitarian access to a besieged population has been used as a weapon of war.
Could this be the endgame in Ghouta? Syrian government forces aim to advance into the region east of Damascus, one bite at a time. That's according to a pro-government commander. They've taken control of some villages in the area of Maraj and have made notable advances on the western edge of the rebel enclave at Harasta, the spokesman says. This despite a UN resolution calling for a 30-day countrywide truce. What truce, he says. Call this a truce. 10 days of constant strikes and we're hiding in basements. Russian strikes and barrel bombs. What truce? What sort of government is this? Monitors say the government bombardment of Ghouta has killed 617 people since February the 18th. Intensified rebel shelling of government-held areas of Damascus has reportedly killed 27. Rebel sources could not be reached for comment on Friday.
The Syrian Army continues to make steady gains against terrorist groups in Eastern Ghouta. While the Syrian Army claims to meticulously adhere to the daily 5-hour ceasefire, it complains of the militants violating it, even preventing civilians from using the humanitarian corridor set up for them to leave the area. This is while narratives and counter-narratives persist about what is really happening on the ground in Eastern Ghouta. In this edition of the debate, we discuss the Syrian offensive and the situation in Eastern Ghouta. Let's cross over to our correspondent, Mohammed Ali, who joins us live from the Syrian capital, Damascus. Now, Mohammed, just walk us through this offensive and also, of course, what groups is the Syrian army really fighting against when it comes to Eastern Ghouta?
Yes, the offensive started about a week or two on the terrorist groups in Eastern Ghouta, east of Damascus. the Syrian army have already taken control of several important areas in the western side on the western outskirts of Eastern Ghouta. Today, the army took control of areas of Otaya, Al-Nashabiyah, Harazma, Hosh al-Salhiyah, and Hosh Khrabo. What this means is that the Syrian army is determined to continue with this offensive in order to eliminate the al-Nusra Front in particular and any other armed group that is fighting alongside this terrorist organization. For example, Faylaq al-Rahman also. However, the army is not attacking groups that are considered by the West as so-called moderate opposition groups. For example, Jaish al-Islam in Douma. The army is not attacking such a group and such an area because the United Nations Security Council issued a resolution last month on, of course, having the area of Eastern Ghouta as an area where a ceasefire is taking place. So the Syrian army is taking control of areas that the al-Nusra Front is present in, destroying those strongholds and advancing in those areas and fighting only the groups that are fighting alongside this terrorist organization, which is the al-Nusra Front. In the meantime, of course, as you know, there's this humanitarian corridor opened by the Syrian army with hope that civilians can come out. But so far, all civilians have been prevented to exit from Jaish al-Islam, the group that is considered as a moderate opposition group and which is part of this UN resolution or ceasefire at the end of the day.
Okay, that's Press TV's Mohammed Ali. They're reporting from Damascus via Skype. Mohammed, thanks very much indeed for that update. Let me now introduce our panel of guests for this edition of the debate. Joining us from London is Hafsa Kara Mustafa. She's a journalist and Middle East expert. And joining us from Washington, D.C. is the president of the American Institute for Foreign Policy, Michael Lane. Many thanks for joining us here on Press TV to both of you. Ms. Kara Mustafa, I'll start off with you, if I may. What do you make of the recent gains in Eastern Ghouta? The Syrian government calls it liberation. The West doesn't agree.
Well, I mean, I think what the Syrian government is having to face is a coalition of countries that simply don't want to see an end to this war. Every time we've seen the Syrian government make significant gains against ISIS, against terrorist organizations, and some sort of return to normality for Syria or a start for normality for Syria, you're seeing Western governments come in and actually support new groups, fund new organizations, add new players on the scene in order to perpetuate this conflict. Now, what this means is obviously further bloodshed in Syria and, of course, a propaganda war, which not only means that the war is continuing and ongoing, but of course it allows the propagandists in Western media to actually put the blame and pin the blame almost essentially on Bashar al-Assad in order to push for his ouster. So what we're seeing here, although we are seeing the government make significant gains, as it has throughout the past 7 years, constantly, because of course a majority of the Syrian people still support their government, we are nevertheless going to see more bloodshed because Western powers and Western countries simply want to see this war continue, and by doing so will continue to support further armed groups, further terrorist organizations, and add new players on the scene.
Well, Mr. Lane, what do you say to that? Because there has been a lot of debate about this war of perceptions, this propaganda war, as Ms. Kara Mustafa has pointed out, when it comes to Syria, and particularly right now, Eastern Ghouta. Is the West, through those narratives when it comes to Eastern Ghouta, trying to support the militants on the ground, as our correspondent pointed out, include al-Nusra Front?
Well, some of that has a good deal of weight to it, but I think it really misses the point as to the crisis that we're facing now. Look, there's no doubt, I don't think in anyone's mind, that President Assad's Syrian government forces have won this conflict, and it's only a matter of cleaning up the details and the loose ends on the ground as we speak. The tide turned in 2015 when Russia directly intervened on the Syrian side, and from that point on, it's been one inexorable, preordained march towards military victory for the Assad forces. So I don't really think that's the immediate issue that we're facing. Whatever forces are still battling the Syrian government, and it's very complicated because, as was pointed out, they seem to change and turn on a weekly basis. But what we're facing now is a direct violation of a UN ceasefire order. The Syrian regime, aided and abetted by the Russians, are continuing to pound 24/7 on civilian populations in Eastern Ghouta. The siege has been going on for 5 years. The escalated, most intense part of it has been going on for 3 weeks now. There are massive civilian casualties. There's been what appears to be intentional bombing and taking out of medical facilities, things like that. There's no food. Children are starving. And yet Assad and the Russians continue to violate the ceasefire order from the United Nations.
Right, hang on, Mr. Lane. When it comes to that UN Security Council resolution that calls for a 30-day ceasefire, it specifically says that this ceasefire does not include fighting against terrorist groups on the ground in Syria. And let's not forget, the Russian and the Syrian governments both have said that they've tried to have some form of a negotiated settlement with the groups in Eastern Ghouta. However, once those negotiations broke down, did this offensive begin?
Well, look, okay, so we had a de-escalation area established by agreement, and Russia was part of that agreement. Now we have a ceasefire vote in the United Nations, and Russia voted for that ceasefire agreement. None of this seems to be holding. The escalation of the violence continues, and you know, I agree the ceasefire resolution in the United Nations did not include the agreed upon terrorist groups, but there's no indication that Assad and the Russians are only battling those groups. It looks like not only are they battling any group they can find, but they're indiscriminately battling their own civilian population, which is what makes this a real crisis. If the 30-day ceasefire could hold, if we could have some semblance of evacuation for the civilians, if there could be medical aid and food gotten in there, medicines, things like that, I think the criticism on Assad and the Russians would not be as severe, because clearly they have a military interest in annihilating their opposition. But under the current circumstances, when the United Nations Human Rights Commission says that there's obvious violations of obviously war crimes and crimes against humanity going on, I think we have to take a look at the details.
Well, I would like to pick up on that point. Ms. Kara Mustafa, on Friday, the UN Human Rights Chief Zaid Ra'ad al-Hussein did say that the events in Eastern Ghouta did include, quote, war crimes and potentially crimes against humanity. What would you say to that?
Well, first of all, I would say that anyone with any moral integrity would recognize that this has become such an opaque propaganda war that it's simply not possible to fully understand what is going on. I think there is a war and there are going to be casualties. That's a reality, and I don't think anyone can deny that. But the idea that somehow the Assad forces are indiscriminately slaughtering civilians, I think is not true. I think it's very much part of the propaganda game. And I think also, even coming from the UN, you can pick and choose whatever you want. In 2013, when Western propaganda outlets were saying that the Assad forces were using chemical weapons, UN representatives have said that actually it wasn't Assad forces, it was the Jabhat al-Nusra who'd used chemical weapons. So who do you believe and who do you see? I think the scene on the ground, there is too much smoke, literally, to fully work out what is going on. But what we do know for a fact is that Assad forces are attacking terrorist organizations, and by definition, terrorists, on the other hand, do not abide by the rules of law of warfare, and therefore they attack civilians most essentially. Now, one point I'd like to pick up on is saying that the conflict somehow changed in favor of Assad in 2015 when the Russians came on board. I think the Russians absolutely gave a boost to Assad forces, undeniably, but the Syrian people had already been backing their president from 2011, and I think that the reality on the ground is to say that if Assad didn't crumble, if his government didn't falter from 2011 to 2015, that means that it enjoyed the backing of an overwhelming majority of Syrians, and Russian forces only came in and boosted aid on the military front, but politically and militarily, Assad enjoys the support of an overwhelming majority of his people, and I think that element is important, because when we focus essentially on Russia, it makes the Syrian conflict somehow change. It makes it look as if it's all-powerful Russia that is the main game player and game changer, when in fact what makes Assad survive isn't Russia. What makes him remain in power is the fact that an overwhelming majority of Syrians continue to back him and support him and want to see him remain as their president.
All right, let me change gears here. Mr. Lane, you mentioned that UN Security Council resolution that called for the 30-day ceasefire. Now, at that very meeting when the vote took place, the Syrian envoy to the United Nations, Bashar al-Jafari, spoke out and said that after the passage of this resolution, the West and their regional allies, the backers of these groups that are being fought against in Eastern Ghouta, need to send out that warning to these terrorist groups that they need to stop attacking civilian population, be it Damascus or the other cities surrounding Eastern Ghouta, and that the ceasefire needs to be adhered by them too. But that call never went out.
Well, you know, there's no angels involved in this situation. It's true that the rebel groups and the terrorist groups that they're fighting side by side with have committed numerous violations and would not be anybody's first choice for Secretary General of the United Nations. However, since the increased pressure of the Assad government combined with the Russian air power has been pounding Eastern Ghouta, it seems that the other side, the moderate rebels and the terrorists, have been fighting mostly a defensive war at this point. They don't have the munitions, they don't have the people, they don't have the advantages that Assad has, and they're fighting mostly a defensive war. Look at where we are. We've got over 600 civilians in Eastern Ghouta that have been killed as a result of the Assad and the Russian assault on Eastern Ghouta. They were going at it for, well, as I said, it's been a 5-year siege. It's been 3 weeks of intense bombardment. Somehow, miraculously, or unmiraculously, there were 26 medical facilities that were taken out in a 6-day period of bombing. That sounds to me like intentionally targeting, not a collateral damage of war. I'm used to being in the military. I get collateral damage, but you don't take out 26 medical facilities in 6 days and call that collateral.
Now, Ms. Kara Mustafa, I would like to get your response to that, because this is the second time Mr. Lane has mentioned the targeting of civilian infrastructure, particularly hospitals and schools, during this offensive to liberate Eastern Ghouta.
As I said, I don't believe half of the propaganda that is coming out of Western outlets. And I'd just like to point out something that I found hearing just now rather amusing, was to say terrorist organizations are carrying out defensive attacks against the legitimate government of Syria. I think if you'd heard that, for instance, Al-Qaeda was carrying out legitimate defense against the US government, everyone would be screaming and shouting, and yet somehow it's perfectly acceptable for an American commentator to state that a terrorist organization actually carrying out the destabilization and the destruction of a nation sovereign state of Syria is carrying out a defensive attack against the legitimate forces of the government, I think would seem farcical. And yet here we are hearing somebody actually defending the actions of what it recognizes to be terrorist organizations. So I think it really does show the utter chutzpah that is coming out of Western outlets, of Western commentators when it comes to Syria, when in fact there's a very simple narrative to this very, very now complex conflict, which is that Syria was a nation, a sovereign nation that was attacked from countries that were looking to remove the legitimate government of the country. It was countries that are not democracies, such as the Gulf monarchies. We saw Turkey get involved, then we saw Western powers get involved, looking to have the legitimate president of the country removed. And here we are with this sheer human catastrophe purely as a result of imperialist nations and corrupt Gulf monarchies looking to remove the legitimate president of a country that is merely looking to keep his country in one piece.
Okay, before we go on, Ms. Kara-Mustafa, I'd like your opinion on this as well. As far as those humanitarian corridors are concerned, now Mr. Lane talked about how there needs to be aid that needs to get to the civilian population in Eastern Ghouta. They need to be tended to. They need to be safe from this bombardment and this offensive. And the Syrian army is being very meticulous, according to reports, about trying to adhere to that 5-hour ceasefire on a daily basis. The corridors are being attacked by militants, as we've documented on the ground. However, at the same time, the U.S. State Department has dismissed this truce as a joke. Is it a joke?
Well, anything that would come from the U.S. Department would be a joke, because they have a stake in this and they have decided unequivocally that Assad has to go and that they're pushing and supporting the other side. So anything that comes from the U.S. side isn't to be taken seriously. We can question the motives of Assad and whatever Assad spokespeople say, but let's not take at face value what the Americans are saying, because that simply can't be taken, because it simply can't be true. I think it makes far more sense for Assad forces to look to protect civilians, primarily because it is the majority of the Syrian population, therefore the Syrian civilians, that are looking to keep him in power. These are his power base, and he has all interest in actually not carrying out these atrocities that we're claiming he is, primarily because these are the people who want him to remain in power. The terrorists don't, of course. The rebel groups who are fighting and who are allying with enemies of Syria obviously don't. But the civilian people want to see a return of stability, and they know that the only stability will undoubtedly come from a return of the government forces in power of all of Syria, and therefore they're likely to support him, and he has no interest in carrying out these atrocities.
Well, same question to you, Mr. Lane. As far as this 5-hour truce is concerned and those humanitarian corridors that have been set up for the civilians, if it is really about saving civilian lives, why aren't the militants adhering to it?
Well, first let me go back to something my colleague said just an answer or two ago. And I am not sitting here justifying or defending the terrorists that are involved in this whole thing. I abhor terrorism, but I'm recognizing the reality on the ground, which is that things are so desperate militarily for the combined resistance against President Assad that there is a lot of very uncomfortable and even just outright outrageous cooperation going on between all the groups, and that's the reality of trying to survive on the ground. Now, the circumstances of the ceasefire, there have been claims by the Russians and the Syrians that the 5-hour ceasefires per day are being held to. But they're the only ones that are claiming it. All the other reports out of Eastern Ghouta indicate that the 5-hour ceasefires are not holding up well, and that there is no path for egress for the civilian population. Now, my colleague correctly points out that in the midst of war, there's a lot of room for propaganda and disinformation and things like that, and I wouldn't doubt that there's a lot of that going on both sides. But nonetheless, the fact is the 5 hours doesn't comply with the United Nations ceasefire resolution, which was a 30-day ceasefire to allow for a comprehensive evacuation of non-combatants and medical aid, medicines, food, things like that. Children are starving. That's really the answer to this. I have no doubt at all that at the end of this, the Syrian forces will annihilate the opposition. And I would note that I would disagree with my colleague that President Assad does not serve at the pleasure of the Syrian people. He serves at the pleasure of Vladimir Putin. And as long as Mr. Putin, President Putin, is happy with Assad, he will continue to stay in power.
Go ahead, Ms. Hafsa Kara-Mustafa.
Well, I mean, it would be coming back to the point I made earlier, which is between the Russian intervention, which took place in 2015, and the start of this whole conflict, which started in March of 2011. I think there were 3 years, and in those 3 years, Russia wasn't intervening, wasn't involved in Syria. So the idea that somehow Bashar al-Assad is only in power thanks to Putin is a myth, and it's part of also a sort of slightly bigoted idea that, you know, Arab leaders leaders can only remain in power because of the will of more powerful Westerners and such like. Whereas in fact, the reality is, whilst there are many people who opposed Bashar al-Assad in the first instance, many realizing what was happening in Syria, realizing who the power players were and who was trying to destroy Syria, actually eventually came back and rallied behind their president. And I think as a result, if you take on board all the parties that are involved, Bashar al-Assad enjoys the support of the Syrian people. He is not there because Vladimir Putin wants him or is happy with him to stay. He is there because an overwhelming majority of Syrians still support him.
Well, it seems our arguments come full circle. We're going to have to leave it there. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. That was a journalist and Middle East expert, Hafsa Kara Mustafa, joining us from London, and joining us from Washington, D.C. is the president of the American Institute for Foreign Policy, Michael Lane. I'd like to thank you both for your contribution to this edition of the debate. From me and the entire team here in Tehran, it's goodbye.